Hey, what's up guys, my name is Cherno, welcome back to my game engine series. So last time we started a little bit of a code review. Check out that video if you haven't already. We also fixed a lot of the issues with the IMGUI viewport. And today we're going to continue doing a bit of a code review, and I also want to take a look at where we should what direction we should go in with the continuation of this series. I thought I'd take it in more of kind of a live approach. I mean, honestly, this is just gravitating towards a live stream at this point. But anyway, we're going to take a look at the code base in general, see what we can do to improve it, and what's really going to help us with our whole 2D workflow. So let's dive into it. The first thing I want to do is run this because I actually ran it just before this video and I noticed a bug. If we minimize this, well, actually minimizing it seems to work at this point. Was it? Yeah, so Windows key D, which is supposed to show the desktop, does something weird. It gives us an invalid value from OpenGL, saying that levels, width, and height must be 1 or greater. And the problem really is that the width and height of the viewport is just not, it's not above 0. And we can further look at this by just seeing, okay, sorry, it is above 0, but it looks like the height is a huge value. Not really sure what's going on here. That looks like it's just -1 being expressed as an unsigned int. So I'm not sure why this was reported as a negative number. Yeah, you can see here that the viewport panel size is -6. So it is a negative value that's being cast into an unsigned integer, and then we're obviously getting something that is completely unusable. So what we need to do, and I'm not sure why it's possible to actually query the available content region from IMGUI and get a negative value as a response. That's very odd. I'm not sure how it calculates this. Oh, okay. So that's probably where it's coming from. So DC cursor position from the context, from the device context, or whatever that is. Draw context. That just seems to be completely wrong. So that's honestly, that's really weird. The fact that it's happening, and you saw the Windows key D come through there. How should we fix that? I mean, we can do a very primitive check here to make sure that if it's less than 0, we just clamp it to 0. But more so, what should happen is, well, if we try and resize a frame buffer, and the frame buffer resize, which is what happens here, is outside of a certain range, we should probably either assert or just refuse to do it. So this can happen when we try to maybe resize it with 0, 0 being invalid. So then we basically should not do the resize until we get a valid value, because doing the resize it's not something that we shouldn't be doing that. And it's totally fine to do that, because remember, resizing is actually an extra operation. It's not like we're doing something to make it work. It's more or less like, hey, the size has changed, so recreate everything. So by not doing it, we'll be doing less things instead of doing unnecessary things, which I think is probably important. So what we can do is we can just say that, and I'm not sure if the best place to do that is here, but this is an unsigned integer, so we could say that if width is 0 or height is 0, that's the problem. All right, so we definitely shouldn't resize in that case, but also we shouldn't resize if width is greater than like a maximum frame buffer width, which at the moment, not something that I really know. We could just say static const like uint32t, max frame buffer size. I'll just do s_ for that. Max frame buffer size, and we'll maybe write like, maybe we want like a 16K frame buffer as the absolute largest. I'll write 8192 for now, which is like, fairly large. I don't know if we'll ever have anything above that. I mean, the GPU probably supports 16K or so, but for now we'll write this. The reason I'm doing this kind of in a temporary way is because we shouldn't be looking at the GPU, we should be looking at the GPU capabilities to get these values out. We shouldn't just be magically hard coding them like we are here, and that's part of the reason why it's all weird. Anyway, width greater than frame buffer size, and height greater than frame buffer size. So if any of these values are outside of this range, then we basically don't want to do any of this, right? So we could just write return, and that would be at the end of that. I will actually write, though, a core error here. I'm not sure if this should be an error. Maybe let's make it a warning. And we'll just write attempted to resize frame buffer 2. And then we need the width and height. So width, comma, height, 1. Just to log it. So this should be hit if we press Windows key D. So if I try and do this, it will tell us what's wrong. And this is like more of like a catch-all situation where we're actually handling it at the frame buffer level here instead of doing it back out there and with the IMGUI giving us a weird negative size for some reason. But if I hit Windows key D, you can see my desktop does get shown. And if I bring back Hazel and look at this, you can see that it's warning us that we attempted to resize frame buffer to something completely ridiculous. So this is just a way for us to know what's going on. Because we are taking an unsigned integers, not signed integers, so we lose that kind of negative value possibility. Okay, so that's something that we need to kind of handle. I don't know if that affects anything else. I mean, I guess it does, because if we look at the camera controller and we look at the onResize event, our aspect ratio gets completely messed up. The camera's projection gets set wrong. This is not a good thing to do because anything here is in danger of just being wrong. Now, the reason why it might be permissible is because realistically what this does is recreates a matrix. This doesn't really do much. I mean, it sets the aspect ratio and the camera's projection, but that's kind of it. And what will happen is when we restore the window, I expect us to get another, viewport panel size change, which will mean that it restores it back to a decent value. So whether or not you choose to handle this is up to you. You could say something that if viewport size does not equal viewport panel size, and we could say viewport panel size dot x is greater than 0, so it can't be 0 and it can't be less than 0, and viewport panel size y is greater than 0, then by doing that, that stops this from happening at all. So if I put a breakpoint in here, probably not now, and I'm also curious to see if this actually gets triggered if we minimize, because it might, but it might not, because we actually end up pausing our application if we don't minimize, which I think means that this IMGUI function is just not going to get called at all. But anyway, if we go back here, okay, so it hasn't been called yet, so let's hit Windows key D. Yeah, that absolutely did not get triggered at all. Even though if we put a breakpoint here, yeah, okay, so this isn't running at all. So this must have happened in a situation where maybe we minimized, but it wasn't aware that we did that yet, and so we still had one more call of this code, which then queried the available content region, and then that failed. So it's a bit of a timing issue that we need to think about. All right, anyway, now that we've done that, let's move on. I guess today will be more or less like a code maintenance episode. I have to be honest, I don't even know what to do next, and that's why, I always said that these are going to kind of feel like live streams, because the thing is, I'm very quickly realizing that I don't like this whole artificial game engine series thing. I think that it's not realistic to try and teach how to make a game engine from scratch. I think that it's too hard. It's kind of like if there was a tutorial on how to build a car from scratch, or like a real engine, like you're either going to build something extremely simple, or you're just simply going to have to cut out a lot of realistic work, right? And maybe if you did actually build an engine from scratch by yourself and you had that kind of completed, and I don't even know how you can call that completed, because game engines don't really get completed. Every large game engine in the world that has been developed and it has not gone bankrupt, people are still developing it. People are still working on it. So it's kind of like a philosophical thing that I end up thinking a lot about, because I just end up being unsure about what I'm doing with this series, because it is kind of a big undertaking and it's very difficult. If you look at something like Handmade Hero, which is probably one of the only things that is similar to this, that's a bit different, because there is still a tangible product, which is a game, and games do get shipped eventually. Sure, they might get updated forever like Minecraft, but they still get shipped. Whereas a game engine is the technology used to build games. That is never really finished. The only time that gets finished is if people stop working on it because they move on to other things, right? That's it. It's not because it's done. It's because it gets abandoned. And that is a little bit worrying, because that means that this series will never end. But also I feel like, maybe 3D and all of that stuff aside, I have basically taught people how how to actually get like an application stack with events and lay the foundation for like the quite bare bones base or core of a game engine. And I did that in like kind of a step-by-step series, which is why I made this kind of decision to make this into more of like a live format thing. And I have been toying around with the idea of making this completely live, streamed on Twitch or something like that. So we'll see if that happens, because I think that, and then maybe like putting together like a highlights video for YouTube, which contains all of the actual programming things and maybe not so much the thinking about what on earth to do sections. So that's still a possibility, and I will give that some more thought before I do anything. But my point is that, you know, we're at the stage now where we have to think about what to do, and there's infinite directions we could go in. If I launch this, you know, our whole, like the thing that I want to get to, and I think I wanted to actually have this done by the end of the year, was getting to the point of being able to make some kind of 2D thing with Hazel, right? At the moment, everything that we see here is being rendered, I think, in real time, meaning that like we literally every frame just submit a bunch of quads and we draw them. And you could make a game out of this. I've talked about that before as well. We could, you know, we even tried making a game, which I regret doing, to be honest. But anyway, you can make a sort of game from here, right? Because you have the ability to draw graphics. You could make a class. You could take more of an object-oriented approach, make a class that is an entity that does something, give it some behavior, give it some rendering commands, and you've basically got a game, especially something simple like Space Invaders or Snake or Tetris even, you know, even games with slightly more complex logic. You can do all of that stuff, but we're not interested in that. We're interested in being able to do this kind of stuff without the use of C++ and without the use of recompiling binaries all the time. That is slightly more difficult, and that's where we're going. So if we take a look at this, and by the way, you can hide this tab bar. I'm not sure if there's a way to automatically launch it in that state. I think if we just exit and we go back in, it will be in that state just because the imgui.ini file remembers that stuff. Yeah, there you go. But I don't know if there's a way to force it to only be in this state. Not that that's really required, because we might have multiple scenes open, because this is like our scene kind of panel, or our scene tab bar. But anyway, so to move on with this, what we probably want to do is, I think about an entity component system, and that's something that that's the next big thing I think we're going to start with. And then once we have that, we can start adding components to entities, because once we have entities, and we can actually talk about, well, we can start thinking about what functionality those entities should have and how to add that like in a modularized way using components. When we start thinking about that, we'll need an entity component system. And once we have that, again, you know, I think at that point we can probably start thinking about making more tools to actually add components, to move entities around, to make a static world that is not generated procedurally. And then once we have that and we want to start creating behavior for our entities, then we can probably integrate C#. So that's kind of the rough roadmap for how I see this. I might make more of a formal video talking about this with like a diagram or something, because I know it's very open-ended, and I also literally just thought of this now. But that's kind of my plan. So I do want to eventually make it so that you can click on these things, but at the moment that would be a waste of time, because if we think about it, what is this? What is this red square? It's literally just a quad that we're telling the renderer to render every single frame. It's not a thing. It doesn't exist. It's a quad. It doesn't have any behavior. It doesn't have any. It's just some pixels that we're coloring in. What we need to do is actually make an entity out of that first, that has a transform, that has a size, that has like you know, some kind of sprite rendering component or something that actually brings it to life. And then from that moment on, we can actually create a better system to be able to, for example, select and do stuff with it, as well as being able to create new squares, right? If we talked about that now, if we said, hey, let's go in and make a button that says add square, we could absolutely do that. We could absolutely add some gizmos and ways to move it using the mouse and resize it and do all of that stuff. But it would almost be a little bit of a waste of time, because what we would be doing is manipulating the renderer. We want to manipulate the game state. We want to manipulate the idea of a scene. And we don't have any of that yet. So there's no point in writing a scene until you have an entity component system, because since we're going to be designing this game engine with an entity component system, a scene is something that contains an entity component system and might contain a whole bunch of components. I mean, entities don't really exist in an entity component system because entities are made up of components, and really all an entity kind of is probably an identifier. But anyway, there's a lot of stuff we could think about and a lot of stuff that I don't want to do now. But my point is that, this is the state that we're currently in. We're probably going to start integrating an entity component system, and I think I've talked about the fact that I want to use entity for that, or ent, E-N-T-T, because I could write my own, but I don't think it's honestly not going to be as good as ent. Ent's very popular and it's used by a lot of people, and I might have a separate series on how to write an entity component system for those who are purely interested in learning how to do that. But I would rather use ent and just get on with this and actually create a workflow rather than spending another 6 months writing a complex entity component system, which in turn is probably going to be less supported and not as good as ent. So as a solo game engine developer, I think that a smart decision to make is knowing first of all what area you want to specialize in, and then also making sure that you delegate as much work as possible into third-party code where possible, based on licensing and stuff like that. Because so the area that I want to specialize in, as you guys probably know, I love graphics, I love rendering. That's the code that I want to write by hand. I don't want to use something like BGFX for that because I love graphics. But entity component systems, they're pretty cool, but they're not something that I want to spend half of a year on, especially because I'd rather get this thing working, you know what I mean? And also because I want to start making games with this engine, and it's hard to do that if we actually do this like Handmade Hero, where everything is written from scratch. So we're not trying to be that. And those are my kind of, I guess, reasons for my decision. Anyway, so we'll do that next time. We'll wrap up, we'll probably wrap up this video, not immediately now, but we will continue. We'll probably start with ent or entity, whatever you want to call it, next time, and we'll make a scene system and do all that stuff, and we'll plan it, and I'll talk a lot more about that then. But what I want to do now, since we still have some time, is I want to check out the possibility of just basically cleaning up some of this code, because there's a lot of stuff that I'm not particularly happy with, and there's a lot of stuff that's been merged in, and I just want to basically do a code review of the whole engine. So I don't know if we'll do a code review of the whole engine today, because it's not like, it's not that big actually. I'm used to working with Hazel Dev, which is significantly larger, but still, let's maybe start with, and by code review I don't literally mean like just looking at the code and just seeing if we can, either fix bugs or rewrite certain code. I actually want to look at the usability and what the API provides and see if there's stuff there. And this is just going to be a commentary. So if you guys are interested in that, then stay for the rest of the video. If not, then thanks for watching. Hope you guys enjoyed. Don't forget to hit the like button, and I'll see you next time. All right, so let's start off with application. Now, I want to actually talk about a few different things here, and maybe it's even worth me doing the code review in a separate video where I actually just look at every single line and also talk about where it's going to go from here. So a lot of this stuff, let's start with base. A lot of this stuff is stuff that I didn't add. So this, what I see here, which is a little bit overkill, but what I see here has been added via pull requests, and it's fine that it's been added because it's definitely not doing any harm. It is definitely making this code a little bit more intense, but the reason this exists is basically a whole bunch of platform detection using predefined macros. I'm not the biggest fan of this for a few reasons. So what this is doing, for those of you who don't know, is they're basically checking for compilers on various platforms define their own symbols, whether you like it or not. So for example, is this a C++ compiler? Is this a C compiler? What version of the C++ compiler is this? What platform is this? Stuff like that. They just have basically built-in definitions. So in other words, if I take this code and I compile it on Clang, on Linux or whatever, it's going to not have the Win32 macro defined or this symbol defined, even though Windows and MSVC will actually have that defined. So if we take the predefined symbols that certain platforms and compilers have, and I mean, by platforms, I mean compilers on platforms. Obviously, it's always the compiler providing these symbols. If we take that, then we can deduce what environment we're running in automatically without having to define things up front. So, for example, you can see that if Win32 is defined and Win64 is defined, then we define HZ platform windows. If it's not, then we actually just put in a little compile error here that says that x86 builds are not supported. That seems reasonable. So in other words, you need to be, if you're building on Windows, then you need to make sure that you're building in a 64-bit environment with a 64-bit compiler. Makes sense, right? If Win32 is not defined and Apple is defined, or Macintosh, then target conditionals is included, which not 100% sure why, but target OS Mac exists on all the platforms, so we must check all of them to ensure that we're running on Mac and not some other Apple platform. Okay, so a whole bunch of code once again to detect whether or not this is the iOS simulator, whether or not it's an iPhone, it's a Mac OS, and you can see we're even defining HZ platform iOS, which is not even supported right now, which is why there is an error here, which is good. I would have been upset if there wasn't an error, because we would lead people to believe that we support that if we don't, which is not great. Same with Android, same with Linux. You guys get the point. Now, the problem with this, and the reason why I don't like this necessarily, is first of all, it takes control away from the person writing the build system, and it kind of relies on certain definitions to be defined on certain compilers. Now, yes, certain compilers on certain platforms do guarantee that these things exist, and that's fine, and I don't doubt that this code works. What I don't like, though, is first of all, in order for these symbols to be defined, base.h has to be included everywhere. Now, is it included everywhere? The answer is no. It is, I believe, included in the precompiled header. It's not included in the precompiled header. Okay, that's even worse because, as you guys probably know, the precompiled header is included in every single CPP file at the moment. Now, Hazel Dev, as a more complicated example, does not include the precompiled header in every CPP file. The reason is some third-party libraries are being compiled as part of the as part of the core Hazel module, and we don't want to inject them with our code. And so because of that, we just disable precompiled headers for those individual CPP files. In which case, again, we wouldn't get the HZ platform definitions, but we don't even care about that, right? Now, the thing is, because the precompiled header does not, well, I mean, it might actually, because I think log includes base, so I guess I'm wrong. But you guys probably are starting to see, hopefully, that it's a little bit flaky. It's a little bit Dogecoin, right? Dodgy. Because you know, we might decide, oh, we don't want log. We don't want log in the precompiled header. It changes too often. It's slowing down our builds. Let's get rid of it. And then suddenly, inadvertently, we've lost base. And actually, you saw that immediately. This changed. This used to be included. And then it was no longer included. Right? Now it is again. Because we've removed log. Now, why would removing log remove HZ platform windows? That doesn't make any sense, does it? And yet it does. So things like that, decisions like that, are so important to think about when you're working on large, complex projects. Because if you don't scrutinize every bit of code that you write, and I'm not telling you to do this, because if we did this, we would get nowhere. I'm just saying that like a lot of decisions and the way that you make those decisions, they actually might have more of an impact than you might think. And specifically for platform macros, for macros that are absolutely vital to the core build on the platform. My favorite way of defining that, and as you can see, for good reason, hopefully, I mean, it's fine if you have a different opinion than me. I'm just telling you about my opinion. Is defining them in the compiler preprocessor. Because if we stick HZ platform windows into here, then every single CPP file that gets compiled in as part of this project, right, in whatever configuration we set up, which would be all configurations, it is 100% gonna get this, right? Whereas this is slightly dependent on, again, base being included in every single CPP file, and not only in every single CPP file, but before everything else, right? Because you'll also will probably notice that if we do this, right? Look at that, it's gray. You know what I mean? Like it's a little bit flaky, and we're trying to go for not flaky like with Hazel. So anyway, that hopefully this is what I mean by code review. Like I want to actually look in and scrutinize the code a little bit more. I might do so in a live stream so that you guys can so that you guys can ask questions. The more I think about it, the more I really want to convert this series into a live stream format, just so that just so that I can interact with you guys a lot more, because I feel like that's going to be helpful. I feel like, you know, building a game engine going forward is a lot better if people can actually, first of all, help me by correcting things or by making me think about things that I probably didn't think about when I'm writing certain code, but also so that I can answer questions and help people a little bit more dynamically in a more interactive way. So do let me know what you think about that. I might put up a poll or something a bit later, just to get just a little bit more opinion from more people and stuff. But anyway, this stuff is fine. And again, you know, this stuff does really have to be the first thing you do, because after that, you can see even in this file, it gets used, right? So platform Windows, if that's the case, we have hz debug break, which just will break the compiler at that particular line of code if it gets hit. You know, with Linux, we're including signal and we're just raising a signal, which is fine. And that's all we're doing. Assertions being enabled. I don't think we support assertions. With no arguments, do we? And I remember I spent about a day figuring out how to do that. This is why I'm not the biggest fan of like variadic macros and just macros in general, to be honest. I mean, I use them a lot because you kind of have to, and they are useful, I will admit, and I'm not scared to death of them, but I'm not the biggest fan. And the thing is, yeah, I don't know where I'm gonna, let's just go here. Actually, I know there's a bunch of stuff, well, it doesn't really matter where we are, but you know, we have a core assert here. If I just assert false, I don't think it's gonna let us do that. It's not, right? Because it needs another argument. I don't like that. I basically end up doing that. That's stupid. And I didn't like that, so in Hazel Dev, I just made a version of this macro that does not take in arguments, and that is quite complex. I'm probably not going to implement that now, but that's something that's kind of like a to-do, so I'll actually add a to-do here, and I'll write make this macro able to take in no arguments. Not even sure if that makes sense. I don't even know. Okay, whatever. The point is that we want an no arguments except for the condition, obviously. Except condition. Okay, bit fields, whatever. That's fine. Bind event function. We'll keep that in here for now because I think code depends on that. And then we have scope and ref. Now, as it stands right now, we're using this I'm not too concerned about because scope is relatively simple and straightforward, which is just a unique pointer. This though, we're currently using shed pointers for reference counting, which is the main kind of way of managing memory in most game engines. But this is something that will get changed in the future because like in Hazel Dev, for example, we've switched to an intrusive reference counting system. And that's like important for a number of reasons, but this is not going to be here to stay. Which also, like the API that I've used in Hazel Dev is also slightly different to the one that we have here. So that's kind of important. Anyway, point is that this is something that's going to change in the future. And I think that's the entirety of base.h. So as you can see, we've basically done a full engine review at this point. Took like no time at all, right? Entry point, yeah, I think that probably not worth reviewing the rest of this. Performance profiling is good. Key codes, I think this has changed as well. It's now an enum class. I'm fine with that. Realistically speaking, it's better to have it this way than to have it as a bunch of macros, even though we still have these macros, you know, mapping to specific things. And I'm not even sure why we have this, to be honest. If we have this, maybe just because of legacy reasons, because we didn't want to break code that may have been written. Not sure, but either way, that should get removed. One of the reasons why it's important to have this stuff is because, well, first of all, when we move this stuff into C#, it's gonna have to be some sort of enum class. Like, it's not gonna, we don't have macros in C#, and having global constants or like weird static constants is not a good way to go either. So this is a better approach, and there's no real difference about that. These numbers are a little bit dodgy. Like here, at least, you know, we had GLFW3, but now this is kind of like a little bit random. I'm not sure, like, again, this is something that will probably have to be tested on different platforms because they might report different key codes. And of course, I'm not sure if we are going to use GLFW for input forever, because we might want to deal with like Windows raw input, for example, and a few other things that I need to think about. So, so yeah. Anyway, there's still a lot more engine code to review. One of the things that caught my eye, though, was the whole Vertex Array situation, because and I mentioned this, I don't know if I mentioned this when writing the Vertex Array thing, but it's really, how should I put this? It's really, Vertex Arrays don't exist on any other rendering API apart from OpenGL. Vertex Arrays are a little bit of an anomaly, right? Because they don't really make sense. Like vertex buffers, vertex and index buffers, sure, that's a very common graphics concept. Vertex arrays, not so much. Vertex arrays are things that can contain potentially multiple buffers, but the real thing that vertex arrays contain, apart from the fact that they can be linked to an index buffer and all of that stuff, is the actual layout. Now, the layout is very heavily, and should be, and I definitely agree with like DirectX and also Vulkan's design on this, you need to tie your vertex buffer layout to your shader, because that is, you know, you provide a buffer on the CPU that you eventually store in GPU memory in your VRAM, and then you have literally written a program that needs to take in that buffer at that exact same layout, because all it says is binary data, and does something with that buffer. If they have no concept or validation between them, that's just asking for trouble, right? And that's the case with OpenGL, and that's one of my least favorite things about OpenGL. So vertex arrays, I have not decided what to do with them, because they are vital for they are vital for OpenGL. You can't get around using vertex arrays, unfortunately. You can have a global vertex array and then a buffer, and then a vertex buffer that gets rebound every time to a new vertex array, and a whole bunch of other stuff, and you know, so you can basically get away with not using vertex arrays or whatever. But you do, you still kind of probably should use them, maybe, if you're using OpenGL. So another good idea is potentially, because you can see by looking at this code that it's mostly just, I mean, it's literally layout. That's it. I mean, sure, we set an index buffer, and it kind of takes ownership of it. Same with a vertex buffer. We kind of push back vertex buffer into this, but I don't think there's ever been a case, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's ever been a case of us using more than one vertex buffer in a vertex array. I think it's always one, because I don't think I have ever in my life, apart from just to test out whether or not it works, I don't think I've ever in my life used or seen multiple vertex buffers in a vertex array. I have heard that maybe there are some cases in which it would be better to do that, but usually the way that you do this is you just have one vertex buffer with like whatever data you want, and it's all kind of interleaved, and that's how you deal with it. I do think that in some scenarios it might be more cache friendly to maybe have multiple vertex buffers if you only need to read a sub selection, like some kind of subset of attributes, but I'm not 100% sure about what that's about, and I have not, in my experience, done that. So what we could do is just collapse basically a vertex array into a vertex buffer for OpenGL, and this is more something we need to think about when we introduce other rendering APIs. But ultimately, if we do that, if we collapse that into vertex buffer, then every vertex buffer will have a vertex array if you're using OpenGL. And that's kind of that. So that's something to think about as well. Anyway, hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you thought about all the things I kind of talked about. What we're going to do next episode, this was kind of more of a review discussion episode. I mean, we fixed, I guess, the bug with the frame buffer and the IMGUI situation, but ultimately we spent most of it doing a little bit of a code review. There's a lot more I can say, and there's a lot more things that I want to fix up, but ultimately I think we'll leave it as is for now, and next time we'll start with the entity component system. And we will also probably end up fixing the engine as we go. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please don't forget to hit the like button, and also help support this series on patreon.com/the Cherno. Huge thank you to everyone who does help support this. I'm really excited for the future, to be honest. I can't wait to get into actually, making that 2D workflow for it, which basically you could say starts next episode with the entity component system. And maybe I'll see you guys in even like a live format. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.